Okay, welcome everybody to this PSA Parliaments event, the prize-winning PSA Parliaments. That is, we're very lucky today to have a book launch of Hannah White's book, Held in Contempt, What's Wrong with the House of Commons, published by Manchester University Press. We've got a brilliant lineup of speakers. I won't introduce them in any detail because I'm sure we all know who they are. But we've got Nicky Morgan, Conservative peer in the House of Lords, Mark Darcy from the BBC, Alexandra Meakin from University of Leeds, and also the co-convener of the prize-winning PSA Parliaments. And we've got obviously Hannah White, who works for the prize-winning Institute for Government, who also won a prize, the PSA Awards ceremony, where even if we do say ourselves, members of PSA Parliaments swept the board pretty much. Each of our speakers is going to have about 10 minutes to comment on Held in Contempt. We're going to start with Nicky Morgan, then Mark Darcy, then Alexandra Meakin, and then Hannah White will respond. And you know, I don't really need to say it, but the timing of the publication of the book and the timing of this event is pretty much perfect for the kinds of things that we're going to be talking about. So Nicky, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephen, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I don't think Hannah realised quite how timely her book was going to be when she wrote it, and when she asked me to look at it and to potentially submit a comment, which I was delighted to do or welcome. I hadn't appreciated quite what a depressingly accurate read it was going to be, and how it was going to chime with, sadly, so many of my feelings about a place that I have to say I really wanted to be elected to before 2010. I was involved in politics since I was at school. I didn't always want to be a member of Parliament, but after my party suffered defeat in '97, I looked at it and thought they need more women, they need younger people, so I was going to give it a go and be a candidate. I stood in Islington South in 2001, never going to trouble the then Labour MP Chris Smith, who returned with a comfortable majority, and then was selected for the marginal seat of Loughborough in 2004. Didn't quite win in 2005, did 6.5 years candidate to win in 2010. And I'm telling you that really because, of course, there are lots of different people with lots of different backgrounds in the House of Commons. Some people, of course, sort of arrived there by happenstance, I suppose. I was asked and there was an election coming and I just decided to give it a go. But most people in the House of Commons have worked incredibly hard to get there. One of the things is that actually there is no training to be a member of Parliament. And I'm sure we'll come on to discuss it. And I'm beginning to feel that we should have some form of, if not employment arrangements, some form of accountability mechanism for members of Parliament, partly so that they know what's expected of them, but also so their electorates know what's expected of their members of Parliament, what they can and they can't do, what they should and they shouldn't do. Again, most MPs, in my experience, take their role as constituency champions, which in itself actually has become a bit of an issue, but they take that role really seriously. The holding of surgeries, often, as we've seen, sadly, in the cases of Joe Cox and David Amos, considerable personal danger and cost to their lives. But we also saw Stephen Timms, and I don't know if anybody saw the Dispatches programme on Monday night, talking then about the threats to MPs. And of course, we're not the only ones to suffer at that level of abuse. But I think that partly comes about through the frustration of one of the things I want to talk about, which Hannah picks up in her book, which is the dreaded thorny subject of Brexit, which was a subject which for 3.5 years dominated my life, lots of people's lives. It was an extremely miserable experience, regardless of what you thought of the referendum and the result. But I think a lot of the difficulties came about through the frustration of the electorate watching the House of Commons be patently unsuited to trying to find a way through a referendum result. So the first thing really, I suppose, is the fact that we had a referendum, which obviously does not sit easily with the kind of parliamentary democracy that we have. And I think there's a big question mark about whether it's wise for MPs to outsource the votes on something like that to the electorate. Of course, it helps if you've had a manifesto with perhaps clear differences between the parties, and you can see the electorate have voted overwhelmingly for one thing or the other. Obviously, the Conservative Party promised the referendum, which helped to get it to the 2015 very small, but it was a majority nonetheless after the coalition government. I think one of the reasons I was talking about the job description accountability is that I cannot tell you the number of times I had discussions or email contact with constituents. I had to explain to them the difference, the Edmund Burke distinction between representatives and delegates. I think because there was a referendum, because people felt they had voted, therefore, I remember people saying to me, I'm not interested in your view as a member of parliament. I've had my vote, this side won, just get on and deliver it. Of course, as we know, having a vote does not then say this is how the negotiations are going to go, this is what a trade agreement looks like, this is what the future relationship with the EU is going to be, nor do I want to relive any of those particular conversations. But of course, again, I think as Hannah highlights in the book, the issue around parliamentary involvement at all in the delivery, the giving the Article 50 notice, the delivery, the meaningful vote. And I was one of the MPs on the Conservative benches who voted against my party in December 2017 in order to secure that meaningful vote. And I have to say at the time, I really believed that actually, and I still do, that Parliament should be involved in delivering such an important act of foreign policy, diplomacy, economic policy, whatever you want to call it. My great sadness by the time I decided to leave the House of Commons, and actually the fact that the House of Commons was incapable of helping to steer the country, the politics through actually this particular set of questions, I suppose, was one of the reasons why I did leave, because I felt so very disillusioned by that inability. But the fact that ultimately, of course, the meaningful vote failed so many times was part of that. And I have to say I was very disappointed having secured the meaningful vote, that actually I felt that MPs couldn't actually rise to the occasion and help to sort out something very difficult. Because I do think the country was looking for leadership, even at that stage, from its members of parliament. I think there's also, I mentioned before about MPs being constituency champions. So one of the things I've been very fortunate, it's quite an experience. I'm sitting here at the moment in the House of Lords, to be in the House of Lords. I feel very privileged to have a foot still in Westminster, but allowed to have a foot outside doing other things. But I've realised that actually what the House of Lords does bring, and there are debates to be had about the way it's structured and everything else, is scrutiny of legislation, really detailed, knowledgeable scrutiny of legislation by people who really know their stuff. And I think because we have asked MPs to become constituency champions, certainly my party followed, I think they felt a model started by the Liberal Democrats, who became very local champions. If you look at the by-elections that are going to take place next month, there's a big thing in local parties selecting very local people. I think constituents expect their member of parliament to live in their constituency now, and that has implications for expenses and everything else. My husband used to ban me actually from, well, didn't ban me from going supermarket shopping, but he said it was completely pointless going together because I never got past the vegetable aisle because I was stopped, which is lovely, and asked lots of questions and everything else. And he said it was just, and Mark knows my husband, and he said it was completely pointless me going with him because I was basically doing a constituency surgery in the supermarket, and that's lovely. But if you ask MPs to be constituency champions, what that means is they have less and less time for the proper role of scrutiny of legislation. And I'm sure we'll come on to discuss the quality of legislation that ends up on our statute books. Going back to Brexit, the inability to find a way through, I think one of the anecdotes I would recount is you might remember that in spring 2019, there was a vote or set of votes secured to have different options of how Brexit might happen. A number of people really seriously engaged with that. People, I hope, are going to put aside sort of party politics and their own views and everything else. But sadly, I know that the government whips at the time were saying certainly to junior ministers, do not even engage with this process. It wasn't compulsory to vote. And if you remember the suggestion put forward by Ken Clarke about the way forward fell by one vote. And I would strongly suspect that actually perhaps that might have been a way of trying to bring all of this to a conclusion. I mentioned about MPs' views as well, and I'll finish it in a moment. But I think the other thing is that because there is no training to be an MP, there's certainly no training in scrutiny, There's always a criticism, there's far too many lawyers in politics. I wouldn't disagree with that as an ex-lawyer myself. But the point is that a lot of the skills are the same. You are there, obviously, to pass laws, to scrutinise them, to argue, to be an advocate. That doesn't mean that other people, of course, can't do those things, but it takes time to build up a skill and to learn how to do a job properly. And I think there's also, particularly with Brexit, it got very confused between what MPs thought their own personal view was. I remember people saying, but I can't vote for this because I don't believe in it. It's not what, my truth, as it were, and completely forgetting. And I think people were surprised when I used to go on interviews and say, well, my view actually doesn't matter. The fact is we had a vote, people voted for this. We've now got to try to deliver it. And I think a bit more emphasis on that would be hopefully something that would help to chime a bit more with the electorate. The MPs are not there to perpetuate their own views. They are very much there to be representatives, but of course not delegates. The final thing I would just say, and again, we might touch on it, and I know it's been looked at by the IFG and by others. I was involved in the Policy Exchange report about reimagining Whitehall. I also feel that in departments, there is often either a lack of understanding about how the legislative process works. It's hived off to a bill team. I remember, fortunately, I had been a whip, so I was able to help my private offices to understand parliamentary timetable things, everything else. But I still think there's probably too much of a distance. So there is talk, for example, of whether you could second people from the civil service into work in the House of Commons as staff. And I think that might help. I mean, Hannah's book talks quite rightly about the overmighty executive and Parliament not having enough power. But I think some of that stems from the fact that actually Parliament is seen as a bit of an irritation because people don't understand how it works, and the arcane nature, again, as Hannah picks out in her book, of some of the ways that laws get passed or amended. And I think a bit more training of civil servants in departments would help enormously, perhaps to smooth some of those contacts. So, Stephen, I'm going to stop there and look forward to hearing from the others.
Thank you, Nicky. Okay, Mark, straight over to you.
Thanks very much. I'm very interested in what Nicky has just been saying about the very uneasy kind of relationship that's forged when a policy is ordained by a referendum, and then representatives then have to go and, or delegates, whatever they then become, then have to go and try and decide what to do about it. And that's one of the fascinating features of the last few years. The chapter of Hannah's book that I think particularly chimed for me was the one entitled Arcane. I spent a disturbing amount of my life watching parliamentary proceedings and trying to explain them, not always correctly, I fear, to the outside world. And in particular, the Friday proceedings in which private members' bills are discussed in the Commons. And this leads me on to a point that I think is underappreciated both inside Parliament and outside, is that there is actually quite an audience out there, not just for programmes like Today in Parliament, but for the live actual proceedings. Back when Parliament burned down in the 19th century, Lord Melbourne, the then Prime Minister, was offered Buckingham Palace as a new seat for Parliament. All this comes from Caroline Shenton's fabulous book on the subject. And he rejected the idea of shifting Parliament to live in Buckingham Palace because it was such a big building that there would be space for an enormous audience. And the experience of the French Revolution was that having a large audience looking at parliamentary proceedings tended to encourage extremism and general madness. And you ended up with a sort of Robespierre situation of people being guillotined all over the place. And he didn't want that, not entirely surprisingly, as Prime Minister. Well, you've got an audience now. There are thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, occasionally hundreds of thousands of people watching parliamentary debates live, either via Parliament live TV on the internet or on BBC Parliament, but they're watching and they often can't make sense of what they're seeing, which brings me to the point about arcaneness. In a private members' bill debate, you have these strange mannered exchanges where people are trying to talk out a bill and the audience outside hasn't the faintest idea what's going on. And if the rules are explained to them, they think they're flatly irrational. So yeah, I can spot when there's a filibuster underway because you start getting these tremendously mannered little exchanges. Will my right honourable friend give way? I'm delighted to give way to my right honourable friend. My right honourable friend is making a fascinating speech and he's being most generous with his time and is a great expert in these matters. And, you know, minutes are wasted in sonorous parliamentary courtesies as the time bleeds away to the moment when the private member's bill to which someone is opposed is killed off because it runs out of time. I get that because I've been doing this for a disturbing amount of time. People watching outside don't. And sometimes they care very much about what's in that private member's bill. I was very struck watching Twitter reactions to a private member's bill, I think during the coalition years, but possibly slightly later, in which someone was trying to get free parking in hospitals. Now, as someone who spent quite a considerable amount of time with various ill relatives parking in hospitals, I can understand the level of that problem. And clearly there were a lot of people on Twitter who were very exercised about how much they were paying to hospital car parks. And they were watching this sort of jovial exercise in gibbering away until time ran out, which everyone involved in clearly thought was a bit of a giggle. And they really, really didn't. They were really angry. And they were wondering what on earth their representatives were doing. And they were wondering why something that really irked them and pained them was just being treated as a joke. And the answer to that is essentially that while I think in this case the government wanted that bill defeated, it didn't want its dabs on the murder weapon. So it just wanted to be able to say, well, it ran out of debating time. That's the way the wafer crumbles. But I'm inclined to think that, for example, a bit of public transparency and the government having the willingness to make the argument of why it doesn't like a bill and kill it in the cold light of day in an actual vote might have been a great deal more honest. And that's equally true for the people who oppose private members' bills who aren't the government, who can also use the device of talking out to kill things. So that is one example of what an outsider's view may be compared to, when confronted by the games played by insiders. And it's not the only one. Very few people have much idea how the process of considering legislation in Parliament really works. And I include some people in Parliament in that sweeping statement. And when you suddenly discover that, for example, important amendments to a bill at report stage in the Commons might not get considered because of the way the programme motion has been structured, so that certain amendments are so far down that they just get swept away. And when you discover that Parliament, or the House of Commons in particular, doesn't have the ability to decide what it debates almost all of the time, that's really quite startling to people. And you often hear purists arguing that people shouldn't conflate Parliament and the government. Well, I think it's quite understandable if they do, because the government controls the House of Commons. The government absolutely controls the agenda of the House of Commons. Yeah, it can even control when opposition days take place. So while oppositions might be able to get things debated on the opposition days they get, it's within the gift of the government to whisk those opposition days away and reschedule them for later if they need to. So there are all kinds of ways in which the House of Commons lacks the autonomy that people kind of assume it has. And we all remember the heady days of the Wright Report when there was talk of having a House Business Committee. And I remember hearing at the time a quote from attributed to the then Chief Whip, Nick Brown, saying that he would hate to bequeath to his successor after the general election a system he wouldn't want to live with himself. And so the Wright Report, I think, was, if not quite strangled at birth, but it was certainly watered down to a digestible level quite rapidly. And the backbench business system, while an advance for Parliament's ability to control what it debates, is only a very, very minor one, really, especially since there are very seldom anything approaching substantive motions that actually do something debated in backbench time. So you have a situation, and incidentally, there doesn't seem to be any mood to kind of press the boundaries of its power and see what it can get away with either. It seems to have become quite a comfortable, lived-in piece of the House of Commons furniture now. So people expect Parliament to be able to do things that Parliament doesn't do. Oddly enough, the most independent bit of Parliament is the House of Lords, where the government has clearly lost control of a chunk of the legislative process, and where bills can have the living daylights amended out of them by slightly fluid coalitions of peers, and amendments then ping back, and tremendous excitement until the people who think those amendments are a jolly good idea see them collide with the majority in the House of Commons and be rejected, until eventually the House of Lords hoists the white flag, as it will always do as the unelected chamber. So again, you have moments of almost false excitement being built up. Private members' bills are launched in the House of Lords promising to save the environment. And people who support that are tremendously excited to see that particular measures are going to be proposed in the House of Lords, not realising that House of Lords bills go absolutely nowhere. House of Lords private members' bills, I should say, go absolutely nowhere. They go to the back of a queue in the Commons for debate, and with a load of no-mark presentation bills and 10-minute rule bills and other sort of parliamentary plankton, and they're never seen again. So again, you have a situation where expectations are wound up and then deflate slowly. And this contributes, I think, to a increasing disillusionment with the way Parliament works, because the process is now more public and people see things and are aware of things, but only half aware of them, in the sense they don't have the context to know what's going to happen with them next. People also, expect Parliament to have some kind of handle on money matters. And it really doesn't. I mean, the parliamentary scrutiny of how the government spends money is at best an empty ritual, and at worst absolutely deceptive. Estimates day debates are supposed to be the vehicle during which the mighty brains of the Commons focus on how the government is spending billions and billions of pounds of public money. And you need to see those little notes on the order paper. Parliament will be invited to approve all outstanding estimates at the conclusion of this debate, and with a mere flip of the wrist, tens and tens of hundreds of billions of pounds of taxpayers' money are allocated across departments, and no one ever looks at how. The government was absolutely aghast at the idea that, and I suspect any government would be absolutely aghast at the idea that Sir Edward Lee was floating a while ago, that there should be a budget committee that actually looked at the way money was allocated. There was a real drawing up of skirts about that one, but of course it was never going to come to pass because the government would have to approve its own scrutiny. So once again, a whole series of expectations of what the Commons is there for and how it does business are dashed by the reality of a chamber that is pretty much controlled by the government, except in the very rare moments when confidence in a government crumbles or parties fracture, as happened for a brief few months in 2019. And even that isn't a particularly good example of great governance, because Parliament, given the opportunity to express a view, I keep saying Parliament when I mean the Commons given an opportunity to express a view, couldn't agree on a view. I remember many years ago, Natasha Engvols, the inaugural chairman of the Backbench Business Committee, organising the first few backbench debates, saying it was awful because no one had any idea what to do because we didn't have the whips to tell us what was happening. And we really needed the whips to organise things, and we didn't know how to play that. So those are the kind of issues that I think contribute to the perception of Parliament as a rather arcane place that doesn't know the kind of things, that doesn't do the kind of things that the voters out there kind of thought they were sending MPs to Parliament to do. And that's why I'm so impressed with Hannah's proposal there. But I am, however, pessimistic with Hannah's analysis there. I am, however, pessimistic about the idea that there is going to be some great reform movement that changes all this, and Parliament is suddenly going to morph into a great assertive animal that will tell the government what to do. No government of any colour is going to allow that to happen. The most the House of Commons can do is press at the margins, and it doesn't particularly seem minded to do even that. And we'll talk in a minute about R&R, and R&R is almost the classic example of this complete failure to bite on a bullet. And with that, I think concludes my sermon from this small mount.
Thank you, Mark. Alex, over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Stephen. And first, I want to congratulate Hannah on her excellent and, as Baroness Morgan said, very timely book. I think it's a vindication of your conclusions that it becomes ever more timely by the day, but also that your recommendations are becoming even more urgent. And as Mark queued me up, I'm going to say a few words about one of the major themes of the book, which is the Restoration and Renewal Programme, and the fact that we're seeing a modern repeat of the decisions made after the 1834 fire, as Mark discussed, and the fear of public engagement. So, as Hannah's book reports, the Palace of Westminster is falling down, literally, with 14 instances of falling masonry between 2009 and 2019. And the fact it is miraculous, as Hannah says, that nobody has been killed or seriously injured. We are riding our luck in this case. It's, football-sized lumps of stonework are falling down off the outside of the building, and the fact that nobody has been walking past is just pure luck. But as Hannah's book highlights, and as many of you will know, it's not just the exterior of the building that is the problem. So it's the inside as well. It's the boilers, which are decades past their expected lifespan, used daily. The sewage ejector, still in the basement of the building, has been in place since 1888, again, still in use. The rest of the basement's packed with the gas pipes, the electricity wires, the data cables, all jammed next to the ancient steam pipes in a tiny confined space. It's the asbestos that is all over the palace that makes even the tiniest repair work dangerous and costly, and will add to the risk if there was any fire, which, given the mention of the pipes and the wires and the boilers past their lifespan, does happen regularly. So the building is only allowed to stay open, only allowed to have people come and visit, because there are fire wardens patrolling 24 hours a day. And they've put out 19 fires in the Commons in the space of just 3 years. And any one of those small fires could have taken hold, and we could have had a repeat of the 1834 catastrophe. The former leader of the Commons, Andrew Leadsom, said at the weekend, this made news because people were shocked, the building could literally burn down today, tomorrow, or at any time. And the shocking fact is that this isn't news. We've known about this now for well over a decade. And to be honest, it's been known internally for much longer. But in addition to the genuinely life-threatening risks, as Hannah's book notes, there's the less dangerous but still unsatisfactory issues of sewage leaks in people's offices, the mice and moth infestations, and all the maintenance that goes with a massive 19th century building that has been neglected for decades. And as numerous reports have found, the palace is falling apart quicker than it can be fixed. We're literally spending millions of taxpayers' money just to try and fail and keep up with the decay of the building. And that's before you get onto the fact that the building, just isn't suitable for people with mobility impairments or visual impairments, and potentially does not suit the 21st century legislature that we might want to be, and that many people, women and people of colour particularly, feel excluded from the building. So I've been researching and writing about restoration and renewal of the Palace of Westminster for 6 years now. And whenever I talk about my research to the students I teach or to school children when I'm doing outreach work, they are utterly shocked by the state of the palace, and they can't understand how, as a country, we've let one of our most iconic buildings, but also the centrepiece of our democracy, deteriorate to such an extent that it's at risk of complete destruction. And they don't understand how this is able to happen and how nobody is in charge. And this is also what the Restoration and Renewal sponsor body, the current governance body for the project, has found when they've done their own public engagement work. So to quote from one of their reports, "There was shock at how much repair is needed and that the building has been able to get into the state it has without earlier substantive action to address the long-term issues." And Hannah's book, crucially, doesn't just set out all these terrible states of the building, the issues, the problems, but it explains how we've got into this state. And Hannah explains partly it's the cost. It's never easy to think about spending £10 billion plus on politicians, on Parliament, particularly in a cost of living crisis. It's not helping with the optics at all. Of course, I'm duty bound here to mention that we're spending millions just on running repairs at the moment, and the cost of doing nothing, is likely to be far higher when you think of the cost of the catastrophe that is inevitable. But Hannah also identifies the governance failings in Parliament and links it to the other deep-rooted problems in the institution of Parliament. And to quote again, as Hannah says, "The history of attempts to restore the Palace of Westminster is a litany of dithering, buck passing and delay, which illustrates many of the other themes in the book." So there's no single individual that can take charge. When I talk to children, to students about why it's in this state, there's no one person that can take action to corral the Commons and the Lords together to make a decision. And you might look to the relevant government ministers, the leaders of the Commons and the leaders of the Lords. And certainly in the past, we have seen some of those figures stepping up and really leading attempts to fix Fix Parliament, Fix the Palace of Westminster, Andrea Leadsom, Baroness Stowell of Beeston. But the current leader of the Commons and his immediate predecessor show that it's not guaranteed that the minister in this role will take on this responsibility, nor that the government will think that it is in their interests to fix Parliament, that these interests will align. The Speaker of the House of Commons chairs the House of Commons Commission and does, have a responsibility for the thousands of parliamentary staff who are, his direct employees, but again is hamstrung by parliamentary governance. He is the servant of the House rather than a leader or a chief executive. He may think he is unable to act without the authority of MPs. That is certainly, a constitutional position. And even in the case with R&R, where he does have the authority of MPs to act, as shown in 2018 and 2019, may not choose to do so, as we are, currently seeing is the case. It's left us in a situation where, again, as Hannah outlines, all the debates around R&R have focused on the needs and wishes of a small group of the current MPs. And note to Baroness Morgan and to Lord Norton, also in the audience here, the peers, the House of Peers, have been very positive about R&R and the need to move out, and their views have often been neglected in favour of the views of, say, a small number of MPs focusing on their own preferences, rather than the needs of the country as a whole. The building belongs to the nation, but also the needs of the people who will be future MPs. Again, we're talking about R&R possibly not finishing until, close to the 22nd century. The people sitting on the green benches when they are restored and back in place are going to be the school children today, but we're not really listening to them. And where efforts have been made to go out to the public and get them involved in national conversation about what they want from their legislature, which the Parliamentary Works Sponsor Body has been doing and been doing really well and getting fantastic, hugely interesting insights, this has been the direct cause of why MPs now want to abolish the sponsor body, because, as they have said, they have neglected the views of MPs and have prioritised the views of the public instead. This is a real issue because there is a survivorship bias here. We're listening to the people who, have chosen to become MPs and were successful in doing so, rather than the thousands of people who might have looked at Parliament and thought, I really want to make a difference, but I don't think this place is for me. Or to the millions of people who don't even vote in elections because they feel that what happens in the Palace of Westminster has no relevance to them, that this grand and incredible building doesn't work for them. So it's an incredibly depressing situation, as Hannah's book outlines, and there is no real hope on the immediate future as how things stand as R&R. And I can't, we don't have time to get into all the details as to why that is. But what I really liked about Hannah's book, that it isn't just a counsel of despair, as my academic writing often is, as people have had to suffer to read it will know. She sets out clear recommendations to address the main challenge of how to get MPs to think about the long-term interests of the institution. And she proposes changes to the governance of Parliament, to the Commons particularly, to House of Commons Commission, all incredibly welcome and necessary, and would be a fantastic addition or changes to how the Commons works. But I worry that they are necessary and possibly not sufficient. And so I suppose my sort of challenge to put out there is how could we ensure, how do we put that into place? Hannah proposes placing a statutory duty on the House of Commons Commission to think about the long-term interests of the institution. And I think, how do we identify those long-term interests, and who is responsible for doing that would be the sort of challenge there. One proposal, having elections for backbench members of the House of Commons Commission, again, is long overdue. We're 12 years after the right reforms, as it means. But there's a risk that we might end up with Donald Searing's typology of the Westminster man, and as Stephen Bates's research points out, the man in there is often intentional because it's rarely female MPs who play this role. The MPs who care hugely about the future of the institution are often more small c conservative than the current membership. So how do we get people involved, not just members of the Parliament who aren't really interested in the future of the Palace of Westminster because they don't think that's what they're in Parliament to do. How do we get the public involved and really thinking about the future of the building? And are there any more radical steps we can take, not only to protect the future of the building, but to fix the culture of Parliament, which the state of the building is sadly part of? Thank you again, Hannah, for an excellent book.
Thank you, Alex. So 3 excellent commentaries there. Hannah, over to you.
Thanks very much, Stephen, and thanks everyone for joining us today, and thanks in particular to Nicky and Mark and Alex for your very kind thoughts and your reflections, which are very, very interesting, and particularly for me because part of the point of writing the book really was to have conversations just like this one. Maybe this isn't sufficient, again, necessary but not sufficient, as Alex says, because maybe all the people on this call already shared some of the ideas that I express in the book, and we're preaching to the converted. But I think it is important to be talking about these issues explicitly, because a lot of as Mark was really saying, a lot of the things that go on in Parliament, the way Parliament runs, are sort of just assumed to be the way that politics has to be done, and the way that the House of Commons has to be done, has to be run. And there is a sort of sense, I think, sometimes that if you challenge it, then there can be an implication that you don't fully understand the complexity and the history and the importance, because if you did, you wouldn't be making these challenges, which I think is really a bad thing, because it closes down debate and ideas and interesting thinking, as Alex has just been talking about in relation to R&R and the public engagement. So I just wanted to say a few things. I've ended up talking about my book to various audiences, and it always ends up being quite a sort of negative, depressing conversation. And I really regret that, because, I even regret the title of the book, because one of my points is, if we always talk in negative terms about Parliament, that is not going to do anything to improve public confidence in Parliament. And I feel like I've just become really part of the problem, because I am actually a huge supporter of representative democracy, and I think it is the way we should be running the country. And I think there are lots of ways we can think about improving it, but I'm fundamentally a supporter of it, and it doesn't always feel like that. I'm also in awe of the vast majority of MPs who work extremely hard. I don't know how they possibly do their jobs. I think the vast majority of people in the country wouldn't want to do their jobs. Yes, it has some sort of apparent advantages, but and there are also lots of people who would like to do their jobs, but it also has many downsides and many stresses and many terrible things, as Nicky's spoken about. And so I think we should actually be really grateful to the people who put themselves forward for these roles. And so, my critique is notwithstanding that sense that actually I think MPs do for the most part a great job. I think a couple of people have said, this is a very timely book, and even though it's delivered 9 months late to the publisher, it did turn out to be very timely. But then I was reflecting, talking to someone about it the other day, on whether, had I delivered it 9 months earlier, and it had actually come out in September, when it was supposed to be September 21, well, it would have been immediately followed by the Owen Paterson case. And then I started to think, well, maybe there isn't really a time in the last 6, 7, 8, 9 years when it wouldn't have been quite timely to bring out this book. So I think that tells us something. And the fact that since the book's been published, we've had, obviously the ongoing Partygate, which is emerging. I understand the Sugray report is now out. For those, I don't want anyone to leave the call on that basis, but we're still in the middle of Partygate, which has done nothing for the reputation of MPs. We've had the as Alex has said, the step back on R&R with the abolition of the sponsor body. We've had last night the publication of the Standards Committee report on which is reflecting on recommending changes to the MP's code of conduct, a lot of that was the thinking in it was driven by a series of scandals. We've had Owen Paterson, but also David Cameron, Greensill lobbying, and other things that inquiry has picked up. I have to say, by the by, I regret the fact the committee has dodged the question of MP second jobs, and said that although the House of Commons decided before Christmas that there should be reasonable limits put on second jobs, as well as a ban on becoming a parliamentary consultant. And I think that the public would have been reasonable at the time for the public to assume that that was the decision of the House of Commons, and that reasonable limits were going to be placed. It was just up to the Standards Committee to determine how that was to be done. Actually, what the committee has said is they don't think it should be done at all. And I think that the next time that the situation goes wrong, that somebody actually does something that it turns out to be outside the rules, the public will come back and say, but hang on, you told us that you were addressing the issue of second jobs. How come nothing's happened? And I think that is just an example of the way in which public confidence in the House gets chipped away at in a really unfortunate way. It's just a series of things where MPs don't necessarily think at the time this is the most significant thing that's happening. There's always a political reason or objective you're trying to meet in the short term, which makes it the right thing to do. But in the end, it has this negative effect. And I think that is really, and this is something that Mark was really discussing, the fact that the House is shaped by the preferences of current MPs, which constitutionally it obviously has to be that the MPs are the ones who have to decide how to run the House of Commons. But it is in their interest to maintain these series of fictions about the House, which Mark identified. Nicky also talked about, the misconceptions the public may have about the role of an MP, but then, the misconception that the House of Commons might control its agenda, that it can make decisions about how to run or improve itself, that it is in control of money. All these things are fictions, which is reasonable for the public to believe in, and it is not in the interest of anyone in Westminster to reveal in a Wizard of Oz way that this is the case. And as I said right at the start, I think, part of this comes down to the kind of attitude that it's, when you're inside, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, when you're inside the House of Commons as a staff member or an MP, it can be really easy to rationalise to yourself why things have to be done this way, and what the reason is for the complexity, and why you need the arcane rules, and why, from a constitutional point of view, it just has to be this way. And I think and it's really easy to neglect the fact that it is not clear. None of that stuff is clear from the outside, and this is actually actively detrimental. That I always think of the example of the lay members who are now part of the Standards Committee, where for years it was just said, well, of course, it's completely impossible from a parliamentary privilege point of view to put members of the public on a parliamentary committee. It just can't be done until it can be done, because somebody wants to make it done, because there's enough of a political imperative to make it happen, and the sky has not fallen in. And actually, I think a really interesting aspect of the report the Standards Committee put out yesterday was the minority report, the opinion from the lay members saying actually they thought the committee should have gone further and included a duty on MPs to be anti-misogynistic as well as anti-discriminatory. And the fact that the lay members had that facility and that they are on the committee and that they can make that opinion known, I think is really important. But for ages, there was just an attitude of, well, just can't be done. You just can't have lay members. So I think that's just an example of how sometimes an attitude that if you don't understand everything about Westminster, you're not qualified to venture an opinion, can really shut down debate. And that's, I think, just to close, why I wanted to write the book, because I felt that having worked there only for 10 years, and I really felt when I left that I was still very unqualified to say anything about the House of Commons, despite having worked there for 10 years, and despite having then studied the House and worked with lots of MPs since. I felt that I at least was someone who had a perspective who could put that forward, which was relatively unusual because many of my former colleagues do spend, long periods of their life working for the House Service. They don't have a public voice. Lots of MPs, as Alex said, don't see it as their role to sort of comment on the health of Parliament as an institution per se. So that's why I wanted to say some of these things, which, as I say, I think may be shared by the people on this call. I don't know how much more broadly, but I'd be really interested to hear other people's reflections on the book. So thank you.